Hello, this is Bad Vibes. Today's stories are camping, deep wilderness, basically being out in the woods and being scared. Today's video is featuring ZakBabyTV. If you enjoy his narrations, please drop a sub to his channel and sit back, relax, and enjoy. I guess I'll start with some background. I'm a 33-year-old female, but the story takes place when I was a teenager, living in a suburb of Chicago. The village I lived in was quiet and middle class. We lived like a mile away from the police station, and the worst crimes we had were a murder or two and a robbery, only once in a blue moon, 99% of the time, boring and more boring. Unless you had a car, you were stuck just walking around the park at night with your friends. Kinda boring. Anyway, one night, my girlfriend and I decided to hang out at the park with some guys at 12 in the morning. The night was a bit windy and had a full moon. I even got a kiss that night from the boy I liked. But the night wasn't just fun and hanging out late. There was a deep forest by the park with a stream and a playground right next to it. There's two bridges, one of wood that everyone uses, and one bridge made of rocks that was rarely used because it was deeper in the forest. These both went over the stream, connecting the two halves of the forest and park area. I get to the rock bridge in a minute. We hang around on the swings and chatted, and just spent the evening together. I'm sitting and just looking around, talking while enjoying the peace and quiet and the moonlight. I have full view of the forest and the dip of earth that I know leads to the stream. I see something moving over the dip of the earth, some dark shape. It looked like it was crawling out of the forest. An arm, then another arm. It's pulling itself out of the ditch, a figure darker than the surrounding forest. I'm sitting there, frozen. I think I'm seeing things. It kind of lays there on the ground and doesn't move. A flash of fear grips me. What if it comes this way? I look at my friend and no one notices anything. I look back and it's gone. Did it go back or go somewhere? I really wanted to get out of there. Then one friend asks, "Did you guys hear about the urban legend of the rock bridge over the stream? Apparently, some kids or something played on the bridge and fell over and died." What a thing to say after what I saw, but I didn't ask anyone anything, and I just pretended I didn't see anything. But the experience stuck with me. I never talk about it because it must have been my imagination, things that only really happen in scary movies, right? But I really went back to the park after that. And Black Thing, if you're real, I hope we never meet again. Who knows what would have happened if you saw me the same time I saw you. First of all, let's preface this by saying it was very early in the 90s, and as we all know, it was a very different world those days, and I was pretty naive for a kid. Also, I kind of had a messed up childhood. So this was not the worst of things to happen by far, and therefore, I pretty much brushed it off. When I was about 11 or 12 years old, I would visit the Boys and Girls Club a lot, which was pretty big back then, and my parents thought by sending me to a Boys and Girls Club for the summer only made sense. The camp was not an overnight type deal, but featured all the normal things you would expect, like a lake, arts and crafts area, crappy school style lunches. I did the normal camp things like find a girlfriend and get into trouble. The camp was run by counselors, which I can only assume were in their 20s or 30s, and when you're 12 that seems old. And as you would expect, they would come up with very interesting punishments for kids, like being forced to carry one of those huge wooden totem poles in circles of a hot field for some time. I never actually had this punishment, but I remember the older kids doing it. Or just straight punching you in the chest and knocking the wind out of you, which I did experience. One of the counselors that I experienced this with was named TJ, and he was a very large, well-built guy in his 20s. One day I did something wrong and got sent to the lunch area for essentially detention. This area was actually a large concrete floor with a wooden roof that was attached to a cabin that contained the kitchen. It was basically a school lunch setup, where you would come up and choose chocolate milk or orange juice and get served a crappy turkey sandwich, a pack of mayo, and one of those amazing brownies. When I got to detention, I noticed that there was 4 or 5 kids already sitting on the benches, and TJ's in front of everyone by the lunch serving area, pacing and saying something. I sit down and don't really remember what happened until things started to get weird. TJ pulled out a knife and got an apple. He started skinning and stabbing it, and saying stuff like, "This is what I'll do to you if you get into trouble again," and other things of that nature. At the time, I honestly didn't feel scared in any way, due to my tendency to completely shut down when shit gets bad. But I do remember feeling very creeped out, and that he was trying very hard to be threatening. The younger kids, especially a little girl, who was maybe 8 or so, was freaking out and crying. The next thing I remember is him telling her to follow him into the kitchen. I then heard a lot of screams and cries coming from the back of the kitchen. After a while, he came back out with her. Her face streamed with tears. I remember it vividly. He then looked at me and another boy and told us to follow him as he escorted us into a huge walk-in refrigerator and brought us inside. He said, "I want you to both start screaming and acting like I'm killing you in here. If you don't make the other kids scared, I will kill you for real." We did as he asked, and we closed the door and started screaming and wailing. At this point, I honestly thought it was kind of funny because I rationalized that the little girl was told to do the same thing. Anyway, after 5 or 10 minutes, he let us out and told us to go back to the benches. Again, I don't remember anything after this, just kind of a blank. I remember when I got home that night from camp telling my mom about it, and I remember her calling someone, and I think the guy got fired. I don't remember ever seeing him again, and my parents never sent me back. I never really thought about it much growing up, but as the years have gone by, I look back to things that I shrugged off as normal, and now see that they are anything but that. Fifth grade was one hell of a year for me. Geometry Dash 2.0 and Minecraft 1.9 were released. I got my first taste of real gaming when I got a PS4 for Christmas, and I even switched schools halfway through the school year, causing me to meet a lot of new people, and a lot of my new friends became the basis of my social circle that would eventually lead me to becoming one of the more popular kids in high school today. However, I also had a pretty creepy encounter with some random guy that year too. Back in November 2015, when I was in 5th grade, my family and I went on a road trip through Texas. We stopped at various campsites. Our first stop was in Sonora State Park. We were staying there for one night and leaving the next afternoon to go to another state park. The next morning, I went on a bike ride to go to the restroom and saw a random guy waving at me from his campsite. Taking it as a friendly gesture, I waved back at him and continued pedaling down to the bathrooms. I did my business and started to bike back to my campsite when the same guy shouted, "Hey kid, over here." I slowed down to a stop but kept my distance because of stranger danger. "Yeah?" I shouted back. The guy said, "Do you have a girlfriend?" I replied, "No." He then said, "Well, I have a daughter down here with me, and I could hook you up with her. Why don't you come down here so you can meet her?" The guy had nothing set up, no tent or trailer, and the only thing in his campsite was his truck with clear windows, and I did not see a girl at all. This realization sent a sudden rush of horror through me, so I yelled, "I'm fine," and started pedaling slowly enough, and then eventually booking it out back to my campsite. I told my dad, and he said that it was probably nothing and didn't do anything about it. This story sort of creeps me out to this day, because that guy probably had malicious intentions. Shame that there's a lot of people like that in this world. So me and my brother decided to go camping, because we had never done it together before. We set up camp, drank a little, and then went for a hike around the area. For context, there was a horse-shaped access road with camping lots in the middle. When we got back, there was a middle-aged guy with glasses, a button-up shirt, and a vest, jeans and dockers, just standing in the road looking at our campsite. Reminds me of Ted Bundy now that I think about it. He saw us and then acted like he was looking in the sky, or looking in the general direction, but past us or something. He then turned and walked away down the road. But then he came back, staring at our area for a bit. He paced back and forth, but not frantically, for a while, and then walked away. He came back again, still looking, standing perfectly still at our campsite, as we were having some beers. His body language made it seem like he was unsure about us, or something pertaining us. It seemed like he was trying to build up the will to do something, each time staying a little longer. We were pretty sure he was sizing us up to figure out if he could steal stuff or do something worse. I guess he decided that we were too much to handle, both me and my brother being 6 foot, around 200 pounds. He then went to another camp area, down the road, and did the same thing for a bit. Then he walked down the road some more, around a bend, and disappeared. Nothing was stolen and nothing happened to us. Still creepy as hell. We still make jokes about being bum-fucked. Fun times. We never saw him at any other campsite, so we aren't sure if he was camping there. Okay, so I don't really know how to start the story off, but this just happened like an hour ago, and I'm still spooked. So a bit of preface. Me and my friend are home alone right now, and have been for a few hours. Every time my friend comes over, we go to the woods by my house, and it's normally uneventful. We usually throw rocks, and break trees and stuff. Harmless fun. But this time, something else happened. Like I said, we're home alone, and we have been for a while. We went outside to the woods, and the trip was uneventful. But once we got there, something was off. Everything was dark, tons of trees had been knocked down. The entire place was not how I remembered it being. We kept going in, still having our usual harmless fun. And at one point, my friend turned to me and said we should go back. I looked at my phone and decided it had only been 30 minutes, so we might as well stay a little longer. 'Cause it'll be a few hours until anyone would want us to be home. We continued on, finding strange things, like an old crushed Mountain Dew can, probably 10 to 20 years old, and a toy boat which had been completely destroyed by the wind and water and other things, and was probably older than the can. Our plan was to go further than we had ever been into the woods, which isn't very hard for us because I've barely been that deep. After walking for a while, we came to a landmark I knew marked the deepest that we've ever been. A while back, when I was going far in, I came to a bridge built on a log that fell over the river in the middle of the woods. However, one thing was different. There was something sitting on top of it. Whatever was on it was small and resembled the head of an animal. When we got closer, we got a good view of it. It was a deer skull, pearly white and clean, sitting on the bridge with no clue as to who put it there and where the rest of it was. Behind the river, there's a huge hill with a creepy small house on it. And while we were looking around, we heard a creak or some high-pitched noise from up towards it. Freaked out, we began to run, and from behind me I hear my friend scream, and I hear him running behind me. We both keep running, and once we reach the edge of the woods, we step onto the road. I asked him why he screamed, and he said he heard footsteps next to him. We quickly made our way home, and when we got here, the garage door was open. Not knowing if we left it open or not, we ran inside, locking the door, checking the house, and turning on the alarm. Now we're sitting here, and by the time I finish this, it's nearly 2 hours since, and I can't shake the fear of the eerie woods from me. So I used to hear tons of stories about ghosts, and I also watched a lot of horror movies. But since I had never experienced any ghost encounters, I was the guy like, meh, these ghost things are created by humans to make money off of making movies about it and other things like ghost hunters. Okay, let me get to the story. One day, me and my two friends visited a spooky forest. Not nearby, but we managed to get there just to check it out as we love the natural atmosphere. You know, giving my lungs some adrenaline of fresh air. The time we reached there was about 7 p.m. when it was already getting dark. And just to let you know, there's no light source in the forest, except for the entrance and exit, so it was pretty much darker than we expected. My friend had his Apple, and I had my tablet with dual flashlights so we could direct them and use them to see each other. An hour passed and we were having conversations and smoking cigarettes. We were sitting under a tree as it was thick enough for us to both lay our backs on and sit relaxed. We were having a good time until we started hearing a sound, like two rocks smashing into each other, or one rock smashing onto the ground again and again, and we were getting pretty confused. I told my friend that it must be a cat trying to climb a tree, making the weak branches fall off, making the sound like a rock thing. But it didn't stop for like 3 or 4 minutes though. Now after some minutes it stopped for a while, and we were still assuming it was an animal making these sounds. Things went silent for 5 minutes, and we started a conversation about the forest atmosphere being so windy and cold. Then apparently, a rock fell on my friend's head. Wonder how a rock can be up in a tree. 4 or 5 seconds later, a big branch from the tree fell on my lap, scaring the shit out of me. And once again, my friend felt water drops falling on his head and neck from up the tree. How is there water dripping from a tree when rainy season was already over 2 months ago? This night was clearly not our lucky night, as we heard the same sounds of the rock smashing again, but now it sounds like it's getting closer. Immediately, without any options to choose, we decided to run out of the forest as quick as we could. We left the forest safe and sound and headed to our homes. A few days after the incident, one of our friends posted news about the same forest. There was a huge tower, just like a lighthouse, as it said by the post. We saw the tower from a distance but didn't get closer, as it was a rocky area and there was a chance of us falling off a small cliff. So in the post, a boy was passing by the tower, and the first thing he saw was a person, but only its head. The post also said the police couldn't find the body, but just the head of the man, which was already found by the same person who saw it while passing. But my question is, what happened to this guy? How in the world can this ever happen to someone? The weird experience we had a few days ago in that same forest, was this the same guy doing this after his death? My questions will never be answered, and I will never visit that forest again.
I just thought that I'd share a couple of spooky stories from my childhood to get everyone all hyped up for Halloween. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a 3-story old farmhouse right at the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from any other houses, set in an area that hadn't been inhabited for 30 years before we started living in it. Quite often, I was a fairly rambunctious child, so while my mom went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and stay home alone all day. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely and sparse, so I spent most of my time playing in the forest expanse out back. Some distance into the woods, far enough that I could not hear my mother when she called, there was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another. An even larger trunk on its way down was now frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I loved to climb up the jagged stump at the base of its fallen tree and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top because it just got so steep for me to continue any further, and I had a bad habit of freaking out how high up I was. One day I was sitting in my usual spot on the fallen tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck. when I heard something strange from underneath that paralyzed me in shock.
Hey, kid.
I was gripped by a sudden strong surge of fear for a moment. The voice had come from directly underneath me. I strained to look down, but couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time, I just sat there in absolute silence, and I was almost at the point to convince myself that I had imagined hearing a man's voice at all.
I know you can hear me.
His voice was much louder this time, as I yelled something out and scrabbled up to the log a bit higher. Trembling nervously, I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight for dear life. I sat there, trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Although I couldn't see it, the presence of the thing underneath me was still clear. The birdsong was much softer and more cautious this time, and when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faintest echo of human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove to myself that this was all my imagination, by leaning over the ledge as far as I could possibly without slipping right off. Digging hard in the bark behind me, I stretched out along my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth, when suddenly...
Come down here, I'll come up and grab you.
It was so loud. It was as if it was being screamed right in my face. I released my grip on the tree and frightened plunged off the platform. I was saved only by grabbing a nearby branch, and for one awful second, my bare legs dangled in the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point I had never reached before. I sat there, just below the wrestling canopy, pissing myself and staring at the distant base where the splintering wood rose, fully expecting at any moment to see someone crawling rapidly up the pine towards me. Instead, all I heard was the wind whistling in the leaves above and below me, and occasional snippets or bird songs. It was about 2 hours before my mother got home and found me. After much worried searching, trembling, and crying at the top of the fallen tree. Although this incident spooked both me and my mother, in time I somewhat recovered, exhibiting that naive, hard skin of a child, although I never went as far into the forest as I used to, and never again ever approaching that fallen tree. Once I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back, just at the edge of the woods, and to bring it back inside the house. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and a swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. By the time I had made my last round, I would sprint back into the house, spooked. One of my least favorite things about the job was when the shed was full of barn owls. If you have ever seen a barn owl's face straight at you from a dark roof corner, then you will know how uncomfortable that shed made me. One of these nights, it got mistier than it had ever been before. A thick fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to a short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from my house, I found myself feeling disoriented, and more than once I walked in the wrong direction, both times for some reason walking straight into the woods. By the time I had reached my last load, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture and it made my vision blur. Lurching forward, I managed to walk head first into a tree, doubling over and dropping all of the wood. I was bundling onto my feet with a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up, with my foot throbbing pretty hard, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to see my own knees. I decided to head to the house, since we had more than enough wood for one night. However, it was getting pretty dark, and I couldn't figure out which direction I was heading in. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in all directions, trying to figure out my position in the mists, I still couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate. And the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles and mud crunching underneath my feet instead of dew-covered lawn. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even find the shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb, while trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that something else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the fringe of the forest. Screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume was only met with the resounding silence at the depths of the mist all around where I stood, affirming that I had wandered too far from the house to be heard. As a deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a nearby pine trunk. Coming closer, I saw that it was a ripped-out square of pink paper. On it, there was an arrow, pointing left. Looks vaguely like something my mom might have made. I rationalized. To keep me from getting lost, so foolishly, I followed the directions set by that green arrow, shivering in the increasing cold. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 minutes before needing to stop to take a break. My heart was pounding so fast, it was beginning to hurt. As I was sitting down, however, I spied that appeared to be another note fluttering on the nearby trunk. I noticed that this one was embedded with a long nail. It bore another arrow, this one pointing up, and a small, sloppily written note that said, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were my only shot at getting back before nightfall. I was desperate to get the hell out, and my brow was cold with sweat. So I followed the green arrow to a point where I could just dimly make out another spot of pink up an incline of a collapsed stump and leaf litter. At this point, it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes just to see a few meters ahead of me. Following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where I was, I stumbled through the woods, groping out into the mist and feeling the trees, although I was terrified of something unseen grabbing my arm. I came across the third green note, which had another arrow pointing up again, this one leading to an increasingly steep slope that I didn't recognize being anywhere near my house, and with a poorly drawn smiley face right above it. At this stage, I became too freaked out to cope and started to cry there a little. As I slumped against the pine stump, the possibility that I would be out in these woods all night was beginning to sink in, like a syringe being driven into the veins within my arm. I caught a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. Squinting hard, unnerved by these notes, all of which looked fresh and without sign of decay despite the previous week's non-stop rain, I read it from afar. What I read made my blood turn cold. I stood to my knees, dead silent, wobbling on them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any tiny prick of noise in the mist. For a long time, I stood there in the rolling fog, reading and rereading that horrible note over and over again before a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to sprint, blindly, twigs snagging at my ankles and cutting at my face as I ran. Written on the note, in big green letters, was my name. It felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain and mist lapsed onto my back and my neck like the decaying breath of someone running right behind me. Somehow I made it back to the house. All the lights were off and I struggled to find my keys for a moment. When I found them, I bolted indoors and quickly crawled into bed where I remained, unsleeping till morning. Mom just thought I had come inside and gone to bed and hadn't even thought to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, aka some freakish coincidence, that I even found the house at all. The final incident at that damn house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she had never experienced any of the strange things that I had, although we mutually shared the specular oppression quality that that house interior had on us, and its placement in the dreary, imposing woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid, by living out in the country in the opposite direction from everyone else at my school, I did make some tight friends in my first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, which was around 3 miles away, then drove back home. The night went well. We watched a horror movie, suitably, devoured some pizza, and probably smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point. It was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from my mom in all caps. "Is this a prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking this was some kind of joke, I text back, "Calm yourself. Is what a prank?" Almost immediately, the response, "Are you at the house?" Of course, I responded no, though I was thoroughly weirded out. I didn't receive another message until around 3 in the morning, when she told me to go to my grandma's in the morning and not by any means dare to come home. I remember those bleak torrents of rain the day I went to my grandmother's, and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. It was nearly 2 towns away. I had to fight the temptation to go home and drop off my bags, but my mom's disturbing messages from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, Mom and Grandma were having lunch. At first, my mother seemed to be in some sort of composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all the color had drained from her face and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even sent a small glass crashing to the floor after flinching at a cat brushing around her ankles. It wasn't until later that night when my grandma was sound asleep that she told me what had happened. She went further as to forbid me from telling old grandma, out of fear that it would horrify her superstitious soul too much. This was what happened the night I was at Amanda's, as she described in lurid detail. My mother was sitting in the first story in the living room, where she sat on a couch by the fire, curtains open to the view of the sunset on the canopy, going over her latest draft. At first it was so faint that she barely noticed it. But after a while, my mother became aware of, and vaguely irritated by, tiny thumping noises near her head at the window. When she went over to investigate, she saw fat brown moths of a kind we often get at that place, buzzing madly into the glass. Reasoning that this was the cause of the sound, she returned to her work, however feeling rattled in some way. It was when the noises started to get sharper and louder that she paid more attention and saw the rocks that were being thrown by the window in the total blackness of the forest edge. She saw them appear from the shadows of the bush, and then fall in the arc and bounced off the window. Looking carefully, she could see small cracks from where the heavy ones had hit, right beside where her head was moments before. Temporarily captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. Then, with a startled rock, she jumped back from the window as she saw me standing half behind a tree right near the window, grinning wide and staring at her. My one visible eye stretched wide open, showing all the white. She barely shifted a scream, seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did the figure not move or wink, It was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were being shot up from the bush, as they continued to do so in a loud downpour. My face unceasingly continued to press at her, smiling. Thinking this was some sort of sick prank, my mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs, threatening to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of the thing that looked like me behind the tree just started moving as if it was mouthing silent words really, really fast. Suddenly, it turned its head to the side and seemed to be talking to someone else behind the tree, my mom said, who couldn't be seen. But she could see a formless black shape hanging in against the other side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the silent speed-talking thing, then turning and whispering to the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start up again. Then, breaking the spell, she suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to the bedroom on the second story, which is the only one with a working lock, where she shut herself in and sat at the far end of the bed as the rocks began to splatter against the window downstairs, dry heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mother said she did not feel safe. There was an awful smell and a weird humming noise in the walls, as she described. She tried to pray for a time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she caught the distinct vibrant sound of a window actually smashing, and the weird continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as a soft hint of a mumbling voice. In absolute horror, she recognized the voice, and then, virtually too afraid to look, she tilted her head up to the closet door where an awful white face could be seen staring right at her, mouth contorting and gasping in what sounded like high sped-up whispering. The closet door was only a meter from my mother. It started to open slowly. In an unimaginable explosion of terror, she immediately bolted to the door, only to fumble with the lock as bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards, before finally getting out, running out of the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into her car and driving off. She said that as she glanced back right at the end of the prolonged drive, she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at the broken bedroom window, watching as her car got further and further away from our house. This would be their final farewell, as my mother had never stepped foot in that place again. As my mother told this story, she broke down in tears. I didn't doubt her, and I still don't. I honestly and fully believe that she experienced what she said she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house for once and for all. I only went back once with my dad, who I see very rarely now. He came from another state to help us move. Mom had already found a place in town and moved in. My dad and I just loaded up his truck with all that was left inside there. It was a silent and sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spooking to cap it all off, but there wasn't. It was just a relief to be out of there. There are, however, only two things left worth mentioning. 1. When we checked the house for any signs of intruders, we found that several windows, including one in my bedroom and kitchen, had been smashed with rocks lying on the floor. 2. Dad went into the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked how long we had the swing set for. Needless to say, we had never had a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that in a week since we had been gone, Someone had assembled a rope swing set from one of the highest branches of the old pine over the ridge, against which was the fallen log I had stopped climbing many years ago. It was an obviously new rope, and a nicely polished sanded-down wooden seat at the base. Dad wanted to keep my mind from the recent events. He doubted the affair and thought my mother was mentally unstable. Said that a neighbor probably set it up, not realizing it was on our property. Of course, he knew as well as I did that we had literally no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. There was no houses in all that space, and never in my time living there did I even see any other signs of human habitation. But I let it go and was pleased enough just to say good riddance to that horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I found it best to try and forget what had happened at that place. Sometimes, I just can't help but ponder it though. It's been long enough now that I no longer feel scared talking about it, but for a long while I couldn't. Seeing as soon it's Halloween, what better time to share? My grandmother just recently sold the house to a new family, that being a young couple and their little son, shortly after we moved out, despite my mother's desperate insistence that it be left empty. Now she refuses to talk about what happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, although sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the better of me. All I could do was think of that old house, the fallen down tree, the new occupants, and the swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze as a little boy toddles obviously towards it.